Hey everybody, this is Dr. Emily Scherning with American Resiliency. We're here with an up-to-date 2050 climate forecast for all of our friends in Michigan. I know a lot of folks in Michigan. I know a lot of folks on this channel are from Michigan, and I know many people think of Michigan as a potential climate haven. This updated Michigan outlook has some significant changes, and this video has important information for anyone interested in Michigan's climate future, even if you think you know what to expect. Just so you know where you can find my source material, this forecast is based on the National Climate Assessment, which was just updated. We just received the 5th National Climate Assessment in November of 2023. There have been some significant changes in the projections in this new edition. I'm updating the outlooks for every state. I use this 5th National Climate Assessment because it represents the highest consensus climate science available. Your tax dollars paid for the development of this document, and you deserve access to it. Today, we're going to break down the NCA 5 for Michigan. If you want to follow along with me, or if you want to zoom in on any of the figures on your own, you can go to chapters and you can download all figures right there. I'm going to show you the figures. I'm going to tell you the number of every figure beforehand. For your information, American Resiliency is the only nonprofit focused on communicating this important projection information to the public. Let's get rolling. So overall, the conditions I'm modeling for 2050, we're talking about regularly hitting 2C as a global temp increase. That seems like our most likely climate future by 2050. Even if we can stay on target for emissions reduction, 2 is the best we're likely to get. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We've blown through our realistic margin to limit warming to 1.5C to anything approaching business as usual. Our reality is that we will be dealing with change. The first figure we're going to check out today is figure 1.14, which allows us to look at overall changes to the nation projected at 2 degrees C. You can see that Michigan is up in this higher change band. We're starting to understand the Arctic amplification effect more, where climate change is higher towards the poles, and see how that projects around the north. And that's why you're seeing this higher change band up in the north there. As a result of that higher change in the NCI 5, we're now talking about an average annual warm up in Michigan around 5 to 6 degrees by 2050. Those degrees, we're talking about normal American degrees, degrees F. Let's learn how that warm up is going to fall seasonally over the course of the year. We can get a good look at changes to extremes in temperature, which helps us understand seasonal change by looking at figure 2.11. And if you look at this with an eye on Michigan, you should be drawn immediately to this big change in cold days here. Let's zoom in on that. Right around the edges of the hand, you're looking at another full month above freezing. That's the loss of a full month of winter. You can see where the higher change points are around the UP as well, and that you have better relative conservation over here by Wisconsin. Now I've moved us over to a zoom in on the map for temperatures over 95 in the summer. You can see that in Michigan, we're looking at 5 to 10 days, depending on if you're in the lighter or the darker area, of temperatures over 95 in the summer. This is not too bad. This is a relatively mild projection for really hot summer days. Related to those additional days over 95, you are going to be looking at 1 to 2 weeks more of the year where the nights are over 70 degrees. And those warm nights will feel unusual in the region. You can see quite a few more of them are projected towards the bottom of the hand. These warm nights, they make it harder for many types of plants to grow. They can reduce agricultural productivity. However, these relatively small increases in hot days and warm nights are positive. These are strengths for Michigan. Many areas are going to be much more challenging in the summer than Michigan. By 2050, I think that Michigan summers will still be considered pretty mild and desirable. That is a big change to the winter, though, and it will have significant impacts. Let's talk more about those impacts once we build up a fuller picture of the change. Let's build our understanding by looking at the shift in plant hardiness zones. This is going to be figure 11.3. So for my fellow gardeners, we know that we've already had an update from the USDA in plant hardiness zones, where most people have already had validation of their experience of some zone shift. Looking at present day climate normals, here's where we are in Michigan. Range of winter temperatures. You're up in zone 4 here in this part by Wisconsin, where we have relatively more stability shown in some other projections. We go into zones 5, into zone 6. And let's see how this is going to look by 2050 at 2C, how it's projected to look. All right, looking at the mid-century projection, this is a big shift. You're going from zone 5 and zone 6 to zone 6 and zone 7. So one zone that isn't necessarily a huge change, but in terms of what this will do to the landscape, I would expect a significant impact. I want to zoom out a minute and look at where is the nearest zone 7 today. Back up here at present day climate normals, you can see that zone 6, 7 today is down in Kentucky, Tennessee border. So that's the type of winter you're talking about for 2050 in Michigan. And this is a very large distance for organisms to be able to traverse in that time. You're going to have dramatic and challenging landscape shift, particularly as you move up into the peninsula. That's a huge magnitude of change by mid-century. Michigan winters to Kentucky winters. Very high change winter would be very difficult from a landscape perspective. That's a transforming landscape right there. It's not a snow holding or even a snow having landscape in much of that lower peninsula of Michigan by 2050. So taking a step back, just taking a step back to regroup, changes to the summer, not so big, changes to the winter, really big. Overall change for the state is going to be transformative. But to understand how that transformation will occur, we need to talk about precipitation. Let's get into it. That'll help us visualize what's going to happen. All right, here's figure 210. This is our first look at precipitation. We're going to get deeper into it. I think that it's important to note that in Michigan, we see relatively stable outlook at 2 degrees, our most likely future, and 3 degrees. If we start going kind of off the rails here, we can see that at 2 and 3 degrees, most of the state is going to be experiencing a precipitation increase of 5 to 10%, which is going to be useful to offset those warmer summers, right? Plants need to use more water as it gets warmer. We can see that at 3, you're going to be moving into more like a 10-15% increase in precipitation for these parts of the state. I think it's nice to see that relative stability in the outlook in terms of infrastructure work. Most of your more populated parts of Michigan are in areas with a stable outlook at 2 and 3 degrees of a 10% increase in precipitation. That means that the work that we do there, we can have some faith that the flood planning that we do now will be serviceable some generations out. And we do expect some increase in loss from flooding in Michigan, but it's not too bad. Let's take a look at figure 110. You can see in this figure here, figure 110, that by 2050, for much of Michigan, we're expecting like a 0 to 5% increase in average annual loss. That is not as big as we are looking at in many parts of the country. You can see that overall, the Midwest is looking fairly protected from changes in personal flooding damages. York County looked like it was going to be impacted more than 5%. I'm going to show you why now. We're going to look at a map showing intensity of precipitation events. So like when you're going to get those crazy tropical deluge type rains, this is in figure 212. So we can see here in figure 212 that Michigan is looking at some pretty heavy rains. I think the total precipitation on heaviest 1% of days is really helpful for identifying potential deluge type patterns. We can see that much of Michigan is looking at 20 to 30% more precipitation on those really heavy rain days. If we want to look at the average maximum daily precipitation increase, we can see over in western Michigan some pretty substantial increases we're in the 15 to 20% for your annual maximum daily. Your 5-year, your really like out there type storms, you can zoom in and see where the biggest storms over a 5-year period are likely to drop the most precipitation. These tend to be areas that are used to a lot of precipitation, but think about it, they tend to get them as snow, right? By 2050, it is very unlikely that we will get those sort of big snow events. We'll get big winter, spring rain events instead because we're moving into 7, right? We're moving into a plant hardiness zone 7. How often do you get 3 feet of snow staying on the ground in Kentucky? It just doesn't happen. But I don't want to scare you with like a fantasy of biblical type deluges. We're talking about some heavy precipitation events, but we're only talking about 10% more total rain. And what will that be in inches? That's going to help us to like get grounded on how much larger we anticipate these major storm events to be. Here we go, looking at figure 4.3, looking at projected changes in annual precipitation by mid-century, looking at in terms of inches. Michigan doesn't look too bad. We're just talking about a couple additional inches of precipitation a year. All right, knowing that we're just talking about a couple more inches of rain, I think that helps us to not get like all freaked out as we're talking about the future. We need more water to help manage the landscape transition, to help keep mature trees alive. Because if we're thinking about a potential water deficit and a big winter warm up, if you put those together, you ought to be worrying about wildfire. Those conditions would project a lot of potential stress on the forests in Michigan. It's time to check out the worst figure of them all, the fire map. All right, we're looking at figure 7.4, very large fires, perhaps the scariest figure in the NCA 5, in good part because it is written for people who can do a lot more math in their heads than most people can, and I think that this is very likely to be misinterpreted. You might read this and say, oh, we're going to be on fire all the time. This would be a reasonable and frightening first takeaway from it. I want us to take a second to try and actually read this thing. First off, this mid-century projection is an RCP 8.5 projection. So this is if we're at 3 degrees globally instead of 2 by mid-century. Little worse that I'm actually modeling. So we got to remember we can step it down that way. The other and more important way that we're going to step down this terrifying dark color, which is like 1,000. It's a year. No, we're looking at change in number of days as a percentage, average number of days here. So it used to be extremely rare. It used to be maybe every 100 years you'd have condition for very large fires up in the North Woods. This increase in the change of number of days as a percentage means that about every other year, conditions will be in place for very large fires. It's important to see this big change because this is a cry for landscape management, for designing communities with fire in mind, for learning from the terrible wildfires that have impacted the West so severely so that it doesn't come to that in the Midwest. We're talking about high fire danger, again in the region, high fire danger, maybe every other year. So it is alarming to see that big increase in fire risk for the area. I was talking with folks at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission about what's going on with the increased fire risk. They have told me that much like the forests to the west, that indigenous management techniques around the Great Lakes used to involve fire. And they say that some of the risk that we're facing is not just related to climate, but to the fact that these lands have not been traditionally managed with fire for a long time. And they are working to bring responsible, traditional indigenous fire management practices back to the region, which will be an important piece of the puzzle to keeping fire risks low. So those are our projected conditions on the ground. If we try and think of a climate analog for much of the hand of Michigan, we're talking about it turning into kind of a chilled out Tennessee by 2050. Slightly milder summers than Tennessee today, but still hot, humid summers. For the UP, there's a lot more conservation of the current climate in the UP. There'll be less change to the summers than you'll see further south in the state, with only a handful of additional days over 95. In the winters in the UP, you'll see better traditional winter preservation. The winters will have an intensity more like Chicagoland or Milwaukee today. Still pretty ferocious, but you should still expect winter to be shorter, to have maybe another 2 to 3 weeks above freezing, even in the most conserved parts of the state. As a general rule, in the UP, the closer you are to Wisconsin, the more conservation you'll have in your winters and in your summers. This level of change in the state, honestly, it's pretty intense. I know a lot of Michiganders, a snowy winter is part of the identity. It's sad to think about how much of the winter culture will change, that snowmobiling and ice fishing are going to be gone from the region and not come back. And, when we look at the loss of cold, we are seeing a potential big impact on fruit orchards. Fruit trees and nut trees, they produce only if they get the right amount of winter cold for their variety. It seems very possible that many established orchards will be moving well out of their ideal chilling range. When I looked at that red rim around the hand in one of those first figures, I thought about how many beautiful orchards are in that band and how many families would see that and see a really challenging level of change. And there's a lot to grieve there. Talking about the biodiversity too, that's a scary one. There are a lot of winter adapted creatures, northern woods creatures that are going to need to pull northwoods in their range. And that land bridge between Detroit and Windsor, it's going to be just critical, a crucially important wildlife corridor. There are many living things that are going to be moving north, and protecting their ability to move freely is so crucial for protecting our future biodiversity. I mean, you can tell I'm upset. I'm shook by this outlook, but I took a while to sleep on it after I processed the information. And I want to try to separate out my reaction that I'm having as a Midwesterner who's culturally attached to winter, where I felt quite shook by this. But I kept thinking about it and tried to consider the facts. When people talk about Michigan as a climate haven, does this outlook count Michigan out as a climate haven? And the answer is no. I mean, a lot of people probably would like a place with a mild summer version of Tennessee today. I get messages from people all the time who are looking for a place to go with a mild winter. This outlook, plenty of people are going to hear it and see opportunity here. So I don't want to be too bogged down in the negativity related to my cultural perceptions, because there are definite challenges in this outlook, but there are also opportunities. In terms of challenges, the increase in wildfire dangers, that's substantial. Managing fire, responding to fire should be a priority in landscape management and community development in Michigan. The increase in summer intensity and length, you're talking about an area where people may not have air conditioning and they're going to want air conditioning. Any place where it's getting over 95, you need to have a plan to cool down. Michigan is getting more days over 95. I think it's important to consider the needs of Michigan farmers. They're going to need support as they attempt to manage the change in land through this transition. This level of change is going to be very difficult for many of Michigan's most valuable fruit crops. There are likely to be more of those late snap frosts as well, which can be just disastrous for a fruit crop. I mean, a fruit crop is a flower crop, right? So there are times in the year where the plants are very sensitive to cold and to harsh weather. The flowers can freeze. Bees, they don't get out to pollinate if it's too cold and windy. You can see how these could come together in a difficult way with this 2050 outlook. The Michigan agricultural community, because of these challenges, by and large, they're very aware of the coming changes. The Michigan agricultural community is very involved in the climate conversation. They've already had such serious wall-ups the last 5 years. They've been innovating and working hard to try to protect fruit trees from those snap frosts. Dealing with the loss of winter cold is going to be another layer of challenge that they are starting to face and starting to look at new varietals of trees to bring in. This is a tough lift, though. This is a thing where people really need enthusiastic support at multiple levels. From an urban perspective, those sunken highways in Detroit, they don't look great in a place that's going to keep getting these increasingly intense flooding rates. Designing for deluge in the urban environment is going to be important as we think about the Michigan cities that are standing today and that are being rebuilt. Of the time I spent in Michigan, I thought some of the most exciting parts of the state were the neighborhoods in Detroit that were being reclaimed by Black developers. The creative, growing energy in those places is really strong and bright. And I think it's worth saying there is a lot holding people back from development in Michigan. I mean, there are already places where people don't have drinkable water in Michigan. Everyone's heard of Flint, right? Michigan has problems with pollution. Michigan has plenty of water, but it's not all clean. And I would say that Michigan also has structural problems, problems with racism. I don't know about the whole state. I haven't spent a lot of time all around the state, but I spent most of a year in the suburbs of Detroit. I found the racism outrageous. People who thought I looked white would say grotesquely racist things to me as if I would find it charming and we would laugh and that would be the start of our friendship. That was disgusting. People who thought that maybe I looked like a Mexican or an Arab, they would say other sorts of nasty things to me. Also disgusting. I personally experienced structural difficulty enrolling my kids in school, getting a library card, and receiving medical care. I say this as a person who has lived in many places in the US, including Illinois, Arizona, California, Louisiana, and Iowa. I never experienced such a level of challenge in any of those places. There is no place I have personally found to be more viciously racist than the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. I hope that will not be your experience, but I think it's worth sharing, and I certainly hope this is not the general lived experience in Michigan. Back to climate. Michigan's climate outlook is high change, but totally survivable. Major challenges to prepare for include fire and flood. You could build resilience here. Michigan has structural problems, but the state is putting effort into resilience and infrastructure issues. Michigan's climate outlook, like most places, is pretty local, so make sure you check out the relevant figures for yourself, zoom in, see what to expect for your home and your community. I'm wishing you all the best. There is hope. We can prepare for what's coming. Let's get ready. Folks, thanks for listening. I want to take a minute to thank everyone who contributes so much to the AR community. All of the donors, all of the volunteers, everyone who's helping to get the word out. We have so many great projects going on right now that can only be done with volunteer assistance. Our organization has grown to the point where, without the financial help of viewers like you, we would really not be able to sustain operations. Thanks so much for being here with me so that we can do our best and get ready together for the changes that are coming. Talk with you again soon.